The war hall smelled of iron and ancient stone. Torches lined the walls, their flames casting restless shadows that danced across banners stained crimson, not from dye but from battles fought in darkness, in centuries long swallowed by time. The ceiling arched high above, disappearing into a gloom that even firelight could not penetrate. Carved into the stone were runes older than kingdoms, symbols of blood oaths and contracts signed in the marrow of the earth itself. This was the heart of the vampire stronghold, a place where mortals did not tread unless summoned. And he had been summoned. His name was Elias, and he stood now in the center of that vast hall, his breath visible in the cold air, his fingers trembling despite his best efforts to still them. Around him, vampire soldiers stood like statues, silent, watchful, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They wore armor that seemed fused to their bodies, black as midnight, etched with silver that caught the torchlight in wicked glints. None of them moved. None of them spoke. They simply watched him, and in their gaze, he felt the weight of 100 lifetimes pressing down on his mortal shoulders. He had come as an emissary, a representative of the human kingdoms that bordered the vampire territories. The war between their peoples had raged for 3 generations, a brutal stalemate that bled both sides dry. His king had sent him here to negotiate, to plead if necessary, to find some thread of peace before the next winter turned the rivers red again. But now, standing in this place where darkness breathed and hunger lingered in every corner, Elias wondered if he had been sent not as an emissary, but as a sacrifice. Then she entered. The doors at the far end of the hall groaned open, and the temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. The vampire warriors shifted, not with fear but with something else, respect, perhaps, or recognition. Elias turned toward the sound, and his heart, already racing, slammed against his ribs as if trying to escape his chest. She was taller than any woman he had ever seen, easily matching the height of the largest warriors in the hall. Her body was sculpted from war and survival, every line of her form speaking to strength earned through centuries of battle. She wore armor that was both functional and intimidating, a dark breastplate that hugged her torso, scarred and dented from blows that would have killed a mortal 100 times over. Her gauntlets were steel and leather, stained with old blood that no amount of cleaning could erase. A cape flowed behind her, tattered at the edges, moving as if stirred by a wind that did not exist. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Crimson. Not the pale red of dawn or the soft blush of wine, but the deep, burning red of fresh blood under moonlight. They locked onto him the moment she crossed the threshold, and Elias felt the world narrow to just those eyes, that gaze, that presence. She moved through the hall with the confidence of a predator that had never known fear, her boots striking the stone floor with rhythmic purpose. The other vampires parted for her without a word, creating a path that led directly to him. She stopped 3 paces away. Close enough that he could see the faint scars on her face, the sharp curve of her jaw, the way her lips, full and dark, curved into a smile that held no warmth, only dangerous amusement. Her wings unfurled slightly behind her, massive and leathery, veined with crimson that pulsed faintly like a second heartbeat. They spread wide enough to cast shadows over half the hall, a display of dominance that needed no words. "So," she said, and her voice was like velvet dragged over broken glass, smooth and rough all at once, "you are the one they sent." Elias swallowed. His mouth was dry. He had rehearsed his introduction 100 times on the journey here, had practiced the formal words of greeting and diplomacy until they flowed like water. But now, standing before her, all those words evaporated. He managed only a single syllable. "Yes." Her smile widened just a fraction. She took a step closer. 2 paces now. "I am Commander Seraphine," she said, tilting her head slightly, studying him the way a scholar might study an ancient text, curious, analytical, but also entertained. "I lead the Bloodwing Legion. I have fought in wars that your great-grandfather's great-grandfather did not live to see. I have torn through armies. I have ended kingdoms." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over him. "And you," she continued, her tone softening into something almost playful, "you are here to ask me for peace." It was not a question. Elias forced himself to meet her gaze. Every instinct screamed at him to look away, to lower his eyes, to submit. But he had been chosen for this task because he had what others lacked: a stubborn spine, a refusal to bend even when reason demanded it. He clenched his fists at his sides and held her stare. "I am here to negotiate terms," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he expected. "To find a way to end the bloodshed." Seraphine's eyes gleamed. She took another step. One pace. Now he could feel the cold radiating from her body, unnatural and absolute. She was close enough that if he reached out, he could touch her. Close enough that he could see the faint network of veins beneath her pale skin, dark as ink. Close enough that when she spoke again, her breath, cold as a winter grave, brushed against his face. "You fear me," she said, and it was not an accusation. It was a fact, stated with the certainty of someone who had seen fear in 1,000 faces. Elias did not deny it. He could feel his heart hammering, could feel the sweat on his palms despite the cold. He was mortal. She was not. She could kill him before he drew his next breath, and they both knew it. But he did not step back. "Yes," he admitted, and something in his honesty made her pause. "I fear you." Seraphine leaned forward, closing the distance even further, until her face was mere inches from his. Her eyes burned into him, searching, testing. Her wings shifted, curling slightly around them both, creating a space that felt separate from the rest of the hall, private and dangerous. "Good," she murmured. "Fear is honest." And then she smiled again, but this time it was different. Softer. Almost curious. "But you do not run," she observed. "Why?" Elias's throat tightened. The truth was complicated, tangled in duty and desperation and something else he did not want to name. But he gave her the simplest answer. "Because running would not save me." Her smile became a grin, sharp and approving. "No," she agreed. "It would not." She straightened slightly, pulling back just enough to break the suffocating proximity, but her eyes never left his. She circled him slowly, like a wolf circling prey, and Elias forced himself to remain still, to let her look, to endure the weight of her scrutiny. "You fear my body," she said, and the words hung in the air, heavy with implication. "You fear my strength, my wings, my teeth." She stopped behind him, and he felt her presence there, a shadow that swallowed light. "You fear what I could do to you," she whispered, her voice so close to his ear that he shivered. "How easily I could break you." Elias closed his eyes, forcing his breathing to steady. "Yes," he said again. She moved in front of him once more, and when he opened his eyes, she was watching him with something that might have been respect. "Then look closer," she said softly, and there was a challenge in her voice, a dare. "Look at me. Not as a monster. Not as a nightmare. Look closer, human, and tell me what you see." Elias did not know what compelled him to obey. Perhaps it was the strange shift in her tone, the way her voice had softened into something almost vulnerable. Perhaps it was his own desperate need to understand the creature before him, to find some crack in the armor, some humanity buried beneath the legend. So he looked. He looked at the scars on her face, each one a story of survival. He looked at the way her armor bore the marks of 1,000 battles, dented and worn but still unbroken. He looked at her eyes, and for the first time he saw past the crimson glow to the depths beneath, ancient yes but also weary. Lonely. "I see," he began, his voice quiet, "someone who has lived too long. Someone who has fought too many wars. Someone who—" He hesitated, unsure if he was crossing a line. "Someone who is tired," he finished. The hall fell silent. Even the torches seemed to still, their flames frozen mid-flicker. The vampire soldiers around them stood motionless, but Elias could feel their attention, sharp and focused. Seraphine stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly her smile faded. Her wings folded back, tucking against her shoulders. She stepped back, putting distance between them, and when she spoke again, her voice was colder, harder. "You know nothing of what I have endured," she said, and the words were edged with warning. But Elias had seen something in that brief flicker of vulnerability, and he pressed forward, not with words, but with silence. He held her gaze, letting her see that he had meant no insult, only truth. Seraphine's jaw tightened. Then she turned sharply, her cape swirling around her, and gestured toward a side chamber off the main hall. "Come," she commanded. "If you wish to negotiate, we do so privately." She did not wait for his response. She strode toward the chamber, her boots echoing through the hall, and after a heartbeat of hesitation, Elias followed. Behind him, the vampire soldiers watched in silence, and Elias could not shake the feeling that he was walking toward something far more dangerous than any battlefield. The chamber was smaller than the hall but no less oppressive. The walls were lined with maps, old maps, drawn on parchment that had yellowed with age, marked with lines and symbols that Elias did not recognize. A single table dominated the center of the room, its surface scarred and stained, littered with scrolls and daggers used as paperweights. A fireplace roared against one wall, the only source of light and warmth, though the heat did little to chase away the cold that clung to Seraphine like a second skin. She moved to the far side of the table and stood there, arms crossed, watching him enter. Elias stepped inside, and the door closed behind him with a heavy finality that made his stomach twist. They were alone now. "Sit," Seraphine said, nodding toward a chair near the fire. Elias hesitated, then obeyed. The chair was old, wood worn smooth by time, and as he sat, he realized how exhausted he truly was. The journey here had taken weeks, through hostile territory and freezing nights. His body ached. His mind was frayed. But he could not afford to show weakness, not here, not now. Seraphine did not sit. She remained standing, looming over the table, her eyes fixed on him with unnerving intensity. "Your king sent you with an offer," she said. It was not a question. Elias nodded. "He proposes a truce. A cessation of hostilities along the eastern border. In exchange we offer tribute, grain, livestock, metals. Resources your people need." "Resources we can take," Seraphine countered, her tone flat. "You could," Elias admitted. "But at what cost? Your forces are strong but they are not endless. Every raid weakens you. Every battle costs lives, even immortal ones." Her eyes narrowed. "You speak as if you understand war." "I understand survival," Elias replied, meeting her gaze. "And I understand that even the strongest predator cannot hunt forever without rest." Seraphine's lips twitched, the barest hint of a smile. She leaned forward, planting her hands on the table, her wings shifting slightly behind her. "You are bold," she said quietly. "Bolder than I expected. Most humans who stand before me tremble so violently they cannot speak." "I am trembling," Elias said honestly. "You just cannot see it." That made her pause. She studied him with renewed interest, her head tilting slightly, and for a moment, the predator in her eyes receded, replaced by something more human. Curiosity. "Tell me," she said, her voice dropping to a softer register, "why did your king send you? Of all his emissaries, why you?" Elias hesitated. The truth was complicated, tied to politics and desperation, but he gave her the answer that mattered. "Because I was willing to come," he said. "Because I do not believe this war can be won by either side. Because I have seen too many villages burned, too many families destroyed. Because I am tired of burying children." His voice cracked on the last word and he looked away, jaw tight, fighting the grief that threatened to overwhelm him. He had seen things on this war's front lines that haunted him, images that surfaced in his dreams and would not let him rest. When he looked back at Seraphine, she was watching him with an expression he could not decipher. Her arms had uncrossed. Her posture had softened just slightly. "You have fought," she said, and it was not a question. "I have," Elias confirmed. "Against my kind." "Yes. And yet you came here. Alone." Elias met her eyes. "Because someone had to." Silence stretched between them, thick and charged. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling upward. Outside the chamber, the war hall was silent, as if the entire stronghold was holding its breath. Seraphine straightened slowly. She moved around the table, her steps deliberate, and stopped in front of him. Elias remained seated, looking up at her, and the difference in their positions, her standing, him sitting, felt symbolic, a reversal of power that should have terrified him but instead felt oddly intimate. "You fear my body," she said again, and this time her voice was quieter, almost gentle. "You fear my strength. But you do not fear me." Elias frowned. "I do fear you." "No," Seraphine said, shaking her head slowly. "You fear what I represent. You fear the war, the death, the loss. But me." She crouched down, bringing herself to his eye level, so close now that he could see the faint flecks of gold in her crimson irises. You do not fear me, Elias. If you did, you would not look at me the way you do. His breath caught. And how do I look at you? Her smile returned, but it was different now, warmer, more genuine. Like you are trying to understand me, she said softly. Like you see something beyond the monster. Elias could not deny it. He did see something. He did not know what it was or why it mattered, but sitting here so close to her, he felt the edges of his fear blurring into something more complicated. You asked me to look closer, he said quietly. So I did. Seraphine's smile faded, replaced by something raw and unguarded. For a heartbeat, she looked almost vulnerable, and Elias saw the truth of what he had said in the hall. She was tired. Tired of war, of bloodshed, of the endless cycle that defined her existence. What did you see? She whispered. Elias did not think. He spoke from instinct, from the truth that had settled in his chest. Someone who wants this to end as much as I do. Her eyes widened just a fraction, and for the first time since he had met her, Seraphine looked genuinely surprised. Then slowly she rose to her feet. She turned away from him, moving toward the fireplace, and stared into the flames. Her wings folded tightly against her back, and when she spoke again, her voice was distant, haunted. I have lived for 600 years, she said. I have fought in more wars than you can imagine. I have killed more humans than you could count. And do you know what I have learned in all that time? She did not wait for him to answer. That war does not end. It only pauses. It catches its breath and then begins again. Peace is a lie we tell ourselves to justify the waiting. Elias stood, moving to stand beside her, though he kept a respectful distance. He stared into the fire as well, letting her words settle over him. Then why are you here? He asked quietly. Why agree to meet with me at all? Seraphine was silent for a long moment. Then she exhaled, a sound that was almost a sigh. Because, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I am tired of being a monster. Elias turned to look at her, and in the firelight she looked different. Smaller somehow. More human. You are not a monster, he said, and he meant it. Seraphine's head turned sharply toward him, her crimson eyes searching his face for deception, for mockery, for the lie she expected to find there. But Elias held her gaze with quiet conviction, and whatever she saw in his expression made something in her chest tighten, a sensation she had not felt in centuries. You do not know what I have done, she said, her voice low and edged with warning. No, Elias agreed. But I know what you are doing now. You are here. You are listening. That is not the action of a monster. Seraphine's jaw worked silently, as if she were fighting against words that wanted to escape. Finally, she looked away back into the flames, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with something that might have been grief. I led the assault on Greenwich, she said. 10 years ago. I burned that city to ash. There were children in those streets, Elias. Families. And I gave the order anyway because my queen demanded it, because war demanded it, because that is what we do. She paused, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. I can still hear their screams, she whispered. Every night. For 10 years. So do not tell me I am not a monster. The weight of her confession hung between them like a physical thing. Elias felt the enormity of it, the horror, the guilt that had clearly eaten at her for a decade. He thought of the stories he had heard of Greenwich, the tales of the night the vampire legions had descended and left nothing but ruins. He thought of the hatred those stories had bred, the calls for vengeance that still echoed through human kingdoms. And yet, standing here beside this creature who had caused such devastation, he felt something unexpected. Pity. My brother died at Greenwich, Elias said quietly. Seraphine went rigid. Her eyes snapped to his, wide with shock and something that looked like pain. He was a soldier, Elias continued, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. He fought on the walls. He died trying to protect civilians as they evacuated. I hated your kind for years because of that night. I hated you specifically when I learned who had led the attack. Seraphine's face had gone pale, paler than usual, and her wings trembled slightly. And yet you came here, she said hoarsely. Knowing that. You came anyway. Yes, Elias said. Because hating you will not bring him back. Because revenge will not stop the next Greenwich. Because if I let that hatred consume me, then I become the very thing I despise, someone who perpetuates the cycle. He turned to face her fully, and there was a fierceness in his eyes now, a determination that burned as bright as any flame. You want to know why I do not fear you? Because I have already lost everything that mattered. Fear is for people who still have something to protect. I am here because I have nothing left but hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, someone on the other side is as tired of this as I am. Hope that maybe even a commander who burned a city can want something different. Seraphine stared at him, and for the first time in 600 years she felt tears threaten to form. An impossibility for her kind, and yet the ache was there, burning behind her eyes. You should hate me, she said, her voice breaking slightly. You have every right. I know, Elias said. But I choose not to. Because hate is easy. Understanding is hard. And if we are ever going to end this, someone has to take the first step toward the hard thing. The silence that followed was profound. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind howled against the fortress walls. And in that small chamber, two beings from opposite sides of an ancient war stood facing each other, separated by blood and history and pain, yet somehow closer than either had expected. Seraphine's hand moved before she realized what she was doing. She reached out, slowly, hesitantly, and touched Elias's face, just the lightest brush of her fingertips against his cheek. Her skin was cold, impossibly cold, but her touch was gentle. You are either the bravest human I have ever met, she murmured, or the most foolish. Elias did not pull away. He met her eyes and a small, sad smile touched his lips. Perhaps both, he said. Her thumb traced the line of his jaw and she marveled at the warmth of him, the pulse she could feel thrumming beneath his skin, so fragile, so temporary, so utterly alive. It had been so long since she had touched anyone with gentleness, since she had allowed herself to feel anything beyond the cold purpose of war. If I agree to your king's terms, she said quietly, my queen will see it as weakness. She will question my loyalty. There will be those among my own kind who will call for my head. Then we make it look like strength, Elias said. Not a surrender but a strategic repositioning. We frame it as you consolidating power, preparing for a greater offensive elsewhere. We give your queen a reason to accept it that does not diminish you. Seraphine's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. You have a mind for strategy. I had a good teacher, Elias said, thinking of his brother who had taught him to play chess and think 3 moves ahead. And I have spent the last 10 years studying your tactics. I know how your people think. I know what they respect. And what do they respect? Seraphine asked, her hand still resting against his face. Power, Elias said. Control. The appearance of dominance. If you present this truce as your decision, your victory, if you make it clear that you are allowing us to survive rather than begging for mercy, they will follow you. Seraphine's lips curved into a slow smile. You would have made a good vampire, Elias. You understand us better than most of my own kind. I understand survival, Elias corrected. And right now, survival means finding a way for both our peoples to coexist. She let her hand fall away from his face, and the loss of contact left him feeling strangely bereft. She turned back to the table, bracing her hands against its surface, and stared down at the maps scattered across it. There are conditions, she said, her voice shifting back into the tone of a commander. If I agree to this, it will not be a simple cessation of hostilities. There will be terms, boundaries, consequences for violations. I expected as much, Elias said, moving to stand across the table from her. What do you require? Seraphine tapped one of the maps, her finger landing on a region marked in red ink. The border towns, Greystone, Millhaven, Ashford, they remain neutral territory. No military presence from either side. They become free zones where trade can occur, where humans and vampires can interact under strict laws that both sides agree to enforce. Elias studied the map, his mind racing. It was a bold proposal, one that would require significant concessions from his king, but it was also brilliant. Neutral zones would create economic interdependence, making future conflicts costlier for both sides. Agreed, he said. In principle. The details will need to be negotiated, but the concept is sound. Seraphine looked up at him, surprised. Just like that. Just like that, Elias confirmed. Because it is a good idea. Because it creates incentive for peace beyond just exhaustion. Because it gives both sides something to gain rather than just something to lose. She shook her head slowly, a look of bemused respect on her face. You continue to surprise me, human. Elias, he corrected gently. My name is Elias. Elias, she repeated, and the way she said his name, slowly, carefully, as if tasting each syllable, sent an unexpected shiver down his spine. And you may call me Seraphine. Not commander. Not warrior. Seraphine. It felt like a gift, that permission. Like she was offering him something precious and fragile, something she did not give lightly. Seraphine, he said, and her name felt right in his mouth, felt true. They spent the next hours working through the details, poring over maps and documents, debating boundaries and terms with the intensity of generals planning a campaign. But there was something else woven through their negotiations, a current of understanding, of mutual respect, of something neither of them wanted to name but both could feel growing between them. As the fire burned low and the night deepened, Elias found himself watching her more than the maps. He noticed the way her brow furrowed when she concentrated, the way her wings shifted restlessly when she was thinking through a problem, the way her voice softened when she spoke of her soldiers and the responsibility she felt for their lives. And Seraphine found herself drawn to his warmth, to the steadiness of his presence, to the way he listened, truly listened, when she spoke. She had commanded legions, had inspired fear and loyalty in equal measure, but she could not remember the last time someone had simply listened to her thoughts as if they mattered beyond their strategic value. When the first light of dawn began to creep through the narrow windows, they finally sat back, both exhausted but satisfied. They had drafted the framework of a treaty, one that would need refinement and approval from their respective leaders, but one that was actually feasible. Your king will agree to this? Seraphine asked, rolling up one of the scrolls. I believe so, Elias said. He sent me here with full authority to negotiate. He is desperate for peace. His kingdom is bleeding resources and his people are exhausted. This gives him an honorable way out. And my queen? Elias hesitated. I cannot speak for her. But you can. You know her better than anyone. Do you believe you can convince her? Seraphine was quiet for a long moment, staring at the rolled scroll in her hands. Then she nodded slowly. Yes, she said. I can convince her. It will require careful framing, careful timing, but I can do it. She looked up at him, and there was something vulnerable in her expression, something almost afraid. But if I do this, she continued, if I pursue this path of peace, I will have enemies among my own kind. There are those who believe war is our natural state, who see humans as nothing more than food and sport. They will see me as a traitor. Then we will stand together against them, Elias said, his voice firm. Human and vampire alike. We will prove that there is another way. Seraphine studied him for a long moment, and then, slowly, she extended her hand across the table. Then we have an accord, she said. Not just between our peoples but between us. A promise that we will see this through no matter the cost. Elias looked at her offered hand, pale, scarred, powerful, and without hesitation he grasped it. Her skin was cold, but her grip was strong and steady, and in that moment, a pact was sealed that went deeper than any treaty. Together, he said. Together, she echoed. The journey back to the human kingdoms took Elias 2 weeks, but he traveled with something he had not possessed on the way there: hope. The treaty framework was concealed in his pack, protected by waterproof wrapping and his own vigilance. He told no one what he carried, spoke to no one of what had transpired in the vampire stronghold. The knowledge was too precious, too fragile to risk an idle conversation. But he thought of Seraphine constantly. He thought of the way her eyes had softened in the firelight, the way her hand had felt in his, cold but solid real. He thought of her voice when she spoke his name, of the vulnerability she had shown him, of the weight of 600 years of guilt and loneliness that she carried like armor. He had gone into that fortress expecting a monster and had found something far more complicated. A warrior tired of war, a commander burdened by the weight of her own legend, a being who wanted desperately to be seen as something more than the sum of her violence. And against all logic, against all reason, he found himself wanting to see her again. When he finally reached his king's castle, he was ushered immediately into the throne room. King Aldrich was a man in his 50s, weathered by responsibility and grief, and he rose from his throne as Elias entered, hope and fear warring in his eyes. "Well," the king asked without preamble, "do we have peace or do we have war?" Elias knelt, then rose and approached the throne. He drew the sealed document from his pack and presented it with both hands. "We have the framework for peace, Your Majesty," he said. "It will require compromise from both sides, but I believe it is achievable. Commander Seraphine of the Bloodwing Legion has agreed to present these terms to her queen." The king took the document with trembling hands and broke the seal. As he read, his expression shifted from skepticism to surprise to cautious hope. When he finally looked up, there were tears in his eyes. This is more than I dared hope for," he said hoarsely. "The neutral zones, the trade agreements, the mutual defense pacts against rogue factions. This could actually work." "It will work," Elias said with conviction. "If both sides hold to the agreement." The king studied him for a long moment, and something in Elias's expression made the older man's eyes narrow thoughtfully. "You met with her personally," the king said. "It was not a question. The vampire of Greenwich. The one who—" "Yes," Elias said quietly. "I met with her. And?" Elias chose his words carefully. "She is not what the stories say, Your Majesty. She is a warrior, yes, a dangerous one. But she is also someone who wants this war to end. Someone who carries the weight of her actions. Someone who—" He trailed off, unsure how to explain what he had seen in her eyes, what had passed between them in that firelit chamber. The king watched him shrewdly. "You like her?" Elias's head snapped up, his eyes widening. "Your Majesty, I—" "Do not bother denying it," the king said, but there was no anger in his voice, only weary understanding. "I have ruled for 30 years, boy. I know the look of a man who has seen something that changed him. You went into that fortress one person and came back another." Elias's jaw worked silently. Then he exhaled slowly and nodded. "She is not what I expected," he admitted. "And yes, I found myself respecting her. Perhaps more than respecting." The king was silent for a moment, then he descended from his throne and placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. "Be careful," he said quietly. "The heart does not care about species or sides, but the world does. If this peace is to work, it will require sacrifices from many people. Do not let your feelings complicate what we are trying to build." "I understand, Your Majesty," Elias said. But even as he spoke the words, he knew it was already too late. His feelings were already complicated, already tangled with the fate of this fragile peace. Meanwhile, in the vampire stronghold, Seraphine faced her own reckoning. She stood before Queen Lysandra in the throne room, a vast hall of black marble and blood-red crystal, where the very walls seemed to pulse with dark power. The queen was ancient beyond measure, beautiful and terrible, her presence suffocating in its intensity. "You met with a human," Lysandra said, her voice like silk over steel. "And you return with proposals of peace." "I return with strategy, my queen," Seraphine said, her voice steady despite the danger she was in. "The humans are weakened, desperate. This treaty allows us to consolidate our power without expending resources on raids that yield diminishing returns. We create neutral zones where we can monitor their activities, establish economic dependence, and position ourselves for greater expansion when the time is right." Lysandra's eyes, black as the void between stars, studied Seraphine with unnerving intensity. "You speak of strategy," the queen said slowly, "but I sense something else. This human emissary, he affected you." Seraphine's wings tensed, but she did not look away. "He showed me an opportunity," she said carefully. "One I would be remiss to ignore." "An opportunity," Lysandra repeated, tasting the word. "Or a weakness?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Seraphine knew she was walking a razor's edge. One wrong word, one hint of the truth, and she could find herself facing execution for treason. "If I were weak, my queen," Seraphine said, her voice dropping to something dangerous, "I would not have returned. I would have killed the human and continued the war as I always have. But I am not weak. I am practical. And I see an opening that serves our interests better than endless conflict." Lysandra regarded her for a long, tense moment. Then, slowly, a smile curved her lips, a smile that held no warmth, only calculation. Very well, the queen said. Pursue this treaty. But know this, Seraphine, if it fails, if this proves to be folly, the consequences will fall on your head alone. I understand, my queen, Seraphine said, bowing deeply. As she left the throne room, her wings trembling with suppressed emotion, she knew she had just committed herself to a path that could end in glory or destruction. And at the heart of it all was a human whose name she whispered to herself in the darkness. Elias. The treaty negotiations took 3 months. Representatives from both sides met in one of the designated neutral zones, the town of Greystone, which had been evacuated and transformed into a diplomatic ground. Elias represented the human kingdoms, and Seraphine represented the vampire territories, and between them, they navigated the treacherous waters of politics, prejudice, and deep-seated hatred. It was not easy. There were moments when the negotiations nearly collapsed, when old wounds reopened and angry words were exchanged, when representatives from both sides stormed out of meetings swearing the treaty was impossible. But each time Elias and Seraphine would find each other in the private spaces between public sessions, a quiet courtyard, an empty hallway, the town's old library, and they would talk. They talked about the challenges, about strategies to overcome resistance, about compromises that might satisfy both sides. But they also talked about other things. About their lives, their hopes, their regrets. Seraphine told him stories of the world as it had been centuries ago, of empires that had risen and fallen, of the loneliness that came with immortality. Elias told her about his childhood, about his brother, about the small joys of mortal life, the taste of fresh bread, the warmth of sunlight, the satisfaction of work well done. And with each conversation the connection between them deepened. One night, as they sat together in the library, surrounded by books that neither side had read in years, Seraphine asked him a question that had been weighing on her mind. "Do you regret coming to my fortress that first night?" she asked quietly. "Knowing what it would lead to? The complications." Elias looked at her, at the way the candlelight softened the sharp edges of her face, at the vulnerability in her eyes that she only ever showed him. "No," he said simply. "I regret many things in my life, but that is not one of them." "Even though it has made everything more difficult?" she pressed. "Even though we are." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, unable to name what had grown between them. "Even though," Elias confirmed. Seraphine closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, there was something fierce and desperate in her gaze. "I have lived for 600 years, she said, her voice rough with emotion. "I have fought in 100 wars. I have loved and lost and learned to stop feeling because feeling was too painful. But then you walked into my hall, this fragile mortal who should have been nothing to me, and you looked at me as if I were more than a monster. And now..." She stopped, her hands clenching into fists. "Now I cannot stop thinking about you," she finished in a whisper. "I cannot stop wanting to see you, to hear your voice, to know that you are safe. And it terrifies me, Elias, because you are mortal. You will age and die, and I will remain, and I do not know if I can survive losing someone again." Elias reached across the table and took her hand. Her skin was cold as always, but he had grown used to it, had come to cherish it as uniquely hers. "Then do not think about the ending," he said gently. "Think about now. Think about what we have in this moment. Is it not worth it, even knowing it cannot last forever?" Seraphine looked at their joined hands, at the contrast between his warmth and her cold, and something inside her broke. A wall she had maintained for centuries, a defense against caring too much. "Yes," she admitted, her voice cracking. "It is worth it." Elias stood, moving around the table, and Seraphine rose to meet him. They stood facing each other, close enough that he could feel the cold radiating from her body, close enough that she could hear the rapid beating of his heart. "I do not know what this is," Elias said quietly, looking up at her. She was taller, had always been taller, but somehow it felt right. "I do not know if there is even a name for it. But I know that when I am with you, I feel more alive than I have in years. And I know that I would rather have a short time with you than a lifetime without you." Seraphine's breath caught, an unconscious reflex from her mortal life, centuries past. Her hand lifted, trembling slightly, and cupped his face. "You are going to break my heart, Elias," she whispered. "When your time comes, you are going to shatter me. Then we will both be broken," he said, covering her hand with his. "But we will have had this. And then, slowly, carefully, he rose on his toes and kissed her. Her lips were cold, but they were soft, and for a moment Seraphine froze, shocked by the warmth of him, by the gentleness of the gesture. Then something ancient and long buried surged through her, and she kissed him back with a desperation that spoke of centuries of loneliness, of wanting, of denying herself any softness because softness meant vulnerability. Her wings wrapped around them both, creating a cocoon of shadow and safety, and in that moment nothing else existed, not the war, not the treaty, not the impossible gulf between their kinds. There was only this, a vampire and a human, holding each other as if they could stop time through sheer force of will. When they finally pulled apart, both were trembling. "This complicates everything," Seraphine said, but she was smiling, truly smiling, with warmth and joy and wonder. "Yes," Elias agreed, grinning despite himself. "It does." "Worth it?" she asked. "Worth it," he confirmed. The treaty was signed on the first day of spring, in a ceremony attended by representatives from both sides. King Aldrich signed for the human kingdoms, and Queen Lysandra, though she sent a representative in her place, signed for the vampire territories. Seraphine and Elias stood as witnesses, and when the ink dried on the parchment, a cheer went up from the human delegation while the vampires inclined their heads in acknowledgement. It was not perfect. There would be violations, disputes, challenges. But it was a beginning, and for the first time in 3 generations, there was genuine hope for lasting peace. After the ceremony, as the delegations dispersed and the neutral zone began to empty, Elias and Seraphine found themselves alone on the town walls, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "What happens now?" Elias asked quietly. Seraphine was silent for a moment, her wings folded against her back, her profile sharp against the dying light. "Now we see if it holds," she said. "Now we face those who oppose peace and prove that this is stronger than their hatred." "And us?" Elias asked, turning to look at her. "What happens to us?" Seraphine met his gaze, and there was sorrow there, but also determination. "I do not know," she admitted. "We are not enemies anymore, but we are not exactly allies either. We exist in a space that has no name, no precedent. We will have to define it ourselves." "Then let us define it as this," Elias said, taking her hand. "Equals. Partners. 2 people who chose to see beyond what they were told to see, who chose understanding over hatred. 2 people who..." He hesitated, then gathered his courage. "2 people who love each other," he finished quietly. Seraphine's eyes widened, and for a moment she looked as if she might flee. But then her expression softened, and she squeezed his hand. "Love?" she repeated, testing the word. "I have not felt that in so long I almost did not recognize it. But yes, that is what this is." She pulled him close, wrapping one wing around him to shield him from the wind that had picked up as the sun descended. "I love you, Elias," she said, and the words felt like a vow. "For however long we have, in whatever form it takes, I love you." "And I love you, Seraphine," he replied, leaning into her cold embrace, finding warmth in the certainty of the feeling. "Monster, warrior, commander, I love every part of you." They stood together as darkness fell, 2 figures silhouetted against the night sky, vampire and human, predator and prey, now neither and both, simply 2 souls who had found each other across an impossible divide. The months that followed were not easy. There were those among both humans and vampires who saw the peace as betrayal, who worked to undermine it, who plotted in shadows and whispered of revolution. Seraphine faced challenges to her authority, duels with other vampire commanders who questioned her strength. Elias navigated political intrigue at his king's court, where factions formed around those who wanted to honor the treaty and those who saw it as weakness. But through it all, Seraphine and Elias stood firm, both separately in their own spheres and together whenever they could steal moments away from their responsibilities. They met in secret, in the neutral zones where their love was not quite so scandalous, where they could simply be themselves without the weight of history pressing down on them. Seraphine taught Elias about her world, the complex politics of vampire courts, the hierarchies of power, the long memories and longer grudges that defined her people. Elias taught her about human resilience, about the beauty of mortality, about finding meaning in a life that would end rather than stretch on forever. And slowly, impossibly, their relationship became known. Whispers spread through both kingdoms, of the vampire commander and the human emissary, of the unlikely love that had bloomed in the shadow of war. Some saw it as proof that the peace could work, that the two species could coexist. Others saw it as abomination, as proof that both Seraphine and Elias had betrayed their kinds. On a cool autumn evening, nearly a year after the treaty had been signed, Elias and Seraphine met in their usual place, a small cabin in the neutral zone of Greystone, where they could be alone without eyes watching, without judgment. Seraphine arrived first, as she always did, moving silently through the darkness. When Elias entered, she was standing by the fireplace, staring into flames that held no warmth for her, her wings folded tight against her back. "You are troubled," Elias observed, moving to her side. "There is talk," Seraphine said quietly, "among my queen's inner circle. They believe I have grown too attached to the humans, that my judgment is compromised. There are whispers of replacing me as commander." Elias felt ice in his veins. Would Lysandra do that? "I do not know," Seraphine admitted. "She values results, and the peace has held, the neutral zones are profitable. But she also values absolute loyalty, and mine is divided." She turned to him, and there was fear in her eyes, real, genuine fear. "If she calls me back to the capital, if she demands I renounce the treaty or renounce..." She could not finish the sentence. "Then we run," Elias said immediately. "Both of us. We disappear into the wilderness, find somewhere neither side can reach us." Seraphine shook her head. "If we run, the treaty collapses. Everything we have worked for, all the lives saved, all the hope, it ends. The war begins again. Then we stay," Elias said, taking her hands, "and we fight for what we have built. Together." "Against my queen?" Seraphine asked. "Against your king if he turns against us? Elias, we cannot win that fight." "Maybe not," Elias admitted. "But we can try. And if we fail, at least we fail together, having stood for something worth standing for." Seraphine pulled him into her arms, holding him with desperate strength, and Elias felt the tremor in her body, not from cold but from emotion barely contained. "I do not want to lose you," she whispered against his hair. "I cannot lose you." "You will not," Elias promised, knowing even as he said it that it was a lie. He was mortal. She was not. Time would take him from her eventually, whether their enemies did or not. But that was a grief for another day. Tonight they were alive, they were together, and that was enough. They held each other as the fire burned low, as the night deepened around them, two beings from different worlds who had chosen each other over the easier path of hatred. The crisis came 2 weeks later. A group of rogue vampires, dissatisfied with the peace, launched an attack on one of the neutral zone towns. They killed indiscriminately, human and vampire alike, anyone associated with the treaty. The massacre was brutal and swift, and by the time word reached Seraphine, a dozen were dead. She mobilized the Bloodwing Legion immediately, hunting down the rogue vampires with ruthless efficiency. She brought them back to the vampire capital in chains, and she demanded an audience with Queen Lysandra. The throne room was packed with vampire nobles and military commanders, all watching as Seraphine dragged the captured rogues before the queen. Blood still stained her armor, some her own, most belonging to those she had fought to capture alive rather than kill. "These traitors attacked a neutral zone," Seraphine announced, her voice ringing through the hall. "They violated our treaty, murdered our people, and brought shame upon us all. I demand they face the blood court for their crimes." Queen Lysandra leaned forward, her black eyes gleaming with interest. "And what would you have their punishment be, Commander?" she asked, her tone dangerous, testing. "Death," Seraphine said without hesitation. "Public execution, to show all who would undermine our treaty that such actions will not be tolerated." A murmur ran through the assembled vampires. Death was a serious punishment for their kind, not given lightly. The rogue vampires snarled and struggled against their chains, shouting accusations. "She is corrupted by human influence," one of them screamed. "She takes a human lover. She betrays her queen for mortal affection." The throne room went silent. Every eye turned to Seraphine. Even Queen Lysandra stilled, her expression unreadable. Seraphine did not flinch. She met the queen's gaze directly, unflinchingly. "It is true," she said, and her voice carried through the hall with absolute clarity. "I have formed an attachment to the human emissary. But that attachment does not compromise my judgment. It sharpens it. Because of him, I understand the humans better. I can predict their movements, anticipate their needs, manipulate their responses. Because of him, this treaty works. She turned to address the assembled court. You call it weakness to care for a human. I call it strategy. I call it evolution. We have been predators for millennia, and where has it gotten us? Endless war, diminishing territories, constant conflict. This peace gives us power without bloodshed, resources without raiding, security without eternal vigilance. And if my relationship with one human helps maintain that peace, then it is a sacrifice I make gladly for the good of our people. She turned back to the queen. But make no mistake, my queen, my loyalty is to you, to our people, to our future. And any who threaten that future, whether they be human or vampire, will face my blade. The silence stretched. Queen Lysandra studied her commander with those fathomless black eyes, and Seraphine felt her fate hanging by a thread. Then slowly the queen smiled. Well spoken, commander, Lysandra said. Your honesty is refreshing. And your logic sound. Very well. These rogues will face execution at dawn. And your position remains secure, as long as your results continue to justify your methods. The threat was clear, but so was the reprieve. Seraphine bowed deeply. Thank you, my queen. As she left the throne room, her legs nearly gave out from the release of tension. She had gambled everything, her position, her life, her future, on honesty and strategic framing. And somehow it had worked. But she knew this was not over. Queen Lysandra would be watching her more closely now, and any misstep could be her last. On the human side, Elias faced his own reckoning. King Aldrich summoned him to a private audience, and when Elias entered the king's study, he found the old man looking exhausted and worried. The vampire attack on the neutral zone has stirred up the war faction, Aldrich said without preamble. They are calling for retaliation for breaking the treaty. And they are using your relationship with the vampire commander as evidence that you are compromised, that you cannot be trusted to represent human interests. Elias's jaw tightened. My relationship with Commander Seraphine has nothing to do with my ability to negotiate. I know that, Aldrich said tiredly. And you know that. But perception matters in politics, boy. And right now, the perception is that you have been seduced by the enemy, that your judgment is clouded by emotion. What would you have me do? Elias asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Aldrich sighed heavily. I need you to step back from the negotiations. Let someone else take the lead for a while, someone whose loyalty cannot be questioned. Give the situation time to cool, give people time to forget. And if I refuse? Elias asked quietly. The king met his eyes with something like regret. Then I will have no choice but to relieve you of your position entirely. And the war faction will push for harsher measures, perhaps even demand that we break the treaty ourselves. Elias felt the trap closing around him. If he fought this, he would destroy everything he and Seraphine had built. But if he stepped back, he would lose his ability to protect the peace, to influence events, to stand beside her when she needed him. How long? He asked finally. 6 months, Aldrich said. Maybe less if the situation calms. But you must give me this, Elias. For the sake of the treaty. Elias closed his eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices. Then he nodded. 6 months, he agreed. But I remain available if needed. And I will not end my relationship with Seraphine. That is not negotiable. Aldrich studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I would not ask that of you, he said quietly. Some things are worth more than politics. That night, Elias met Seraphine in their cabin, and they shared their respective ordeals. They sat together by the fire, hands clasped, processing the reality of their situation. 6 months, Seraphine said softly. We can survive 6 months. And then what? Elias asked. This will not end. There will always be those who oppose us, who see our connection as weakness or betrayal. How long can we keep fighting this? Seraphine was quiet for a long time. Then she turned to him, and there was something new in her eyes, determination mixed with resignation. I have been thinking, she said slowly, about the future. About what we are trying to build here, not just peace between our peoples but something new. Something that has never existed before. What do you mean? Elias asked. A place, Seraphine said, where vampire and human can coexist not just through treaty, but through true integration. A community where both kinds live together, work together, build together. Where children grow up seeing both species as normal, where intermingling is not scandalous but natural. She looked at him intently. A place where what we have is not unusual but simply is. Elias felt his heart race. You are talking about something revolutionary. I am talking about evolution, Seraphine corrected. I am talking about the next step, the thing that comes after peace. And I think if we do not take that step, if we settle for mere coexistence, then eventually the old hatreds will resurface and we will be back where we started. It would take decades to build something like that, Elias said. Maybe centuries. Then it is fortunate, Seraphine said with a sad smile, that I have centuries. And that perhaps, if you are willing, we could find ways to give you more time than a normal human lifespan. Elias's eyes widened. You mean? Not transformation, Seraphine said quickly. I would not do that to you without your consent, and I know you value your humanity. But there are other ways. Blood bonds that extend life without changing fundamental nature. Magic that can stretch years into decades. It would not make you immortal, but it could give us more time. Elias stared at her, his mind reeling with possibilities and implications. More time with her. More time to build the future they envisioned. But also more time watching his body age while hers remained unchanged, more time existing in the space between human and vampire, belonging fully to neither world. I need to think about it, he said finally. I know, Seraphine said, pulling him close. And whatever you decide I will accept. But know that I want more time with you, Elias. Whatever form that takes. They sat together in silence, holding each other, both knowing that they stood at a crossroads that would define not just their own futures, but potentially the future of their entire peoples. The 6 months passed slowly. Elias remained in the human capital, advising from a distance, working behind the scenes to maintain support for the treaty while others took the public lead. Seraphine commanded her legions, enforcing the treaty terms with ruthless efficiency, making it clear that any who violated the peace, vampire or human, would face her wrath. They met when they could, stolen moments that became more precious for their rarity. And as the weeks turned to months, Elias found his resolve crystallizing. He watched the treaty hold, watched the neutral zones flourish, watched the slow, tentative steps toward true integration, and he understood that this was larger than himself, larger than his fear of change. On the night that marked exactly 6 months since he had stepped back from negotiations, Elias traveled to the vampire stronghold. He had sent word ahead, and Seraphine met him at the gates, her eyes wide with surprise and question. I have made my decision, he told her, there in the shadow of the fortress where they had first met. She waited, barely breathing. Yes, he said simply. To all of it. To more time. To building the future. To whatever it takes to see this through. Because you were right, what we have is not just about us. It is about proving that something new is possible. And I want to be part of that for as long as I can. Seraphine's eyes shone with emotion, tears that would never fall but which he could see in the way her breath caught, in the way her hands trembled as she reached for him. It will hurt, she warned. The process, and there is no going back. I know, Elias said. But forward is the only direction that matters now. That night, in a ritual older than kingdoms, Seraphine performed the blood bond. It was not transformation. Elias would remain human in all ways that mattered, but her blood, shared and accepted, would anchor his life to hers, stretching his mortal years into something more, something in between. The process was painful just as she had warned. Elias felt her blood burn through his veins like liquid fire, felt his body reject and then slowly, agonizingly, accept the foreign substance. He gasped and writhed, and Seraphine held him through it all, whispering words of encouragement in languages long dead, her wings wrapped around him protectively. When it was over, when the fire had faded to a persistent warmth in his chest, Elias opened his eyes and found her watching him with fierce devotion. How do you feel? She asked. He took inventory. He still felt human. His heart still beat, his breath still came warm, his skin still held the flush of mortal blood. But there was something else now, a thrumming awareness of her, a connection that went deeper than touch or sight. Different, he said finally. But still myself. Still human. Good, Seraphine said, relief clear in her voice. The bond should give you perhaps another 50 years beyond your normal span, possibly more. Time to build what we envisioned. Time to see it take root. Time to spend with you, Elias added, pulling her down into a kiss. Time to spend with you, she echoed against his lips. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were setbacks, rebellions, moments when the fragile peace nearly shattered. But Elias and Seraphine stood firm, becoming symbols of what was possible. Vampire and human, warrior and emissary, lovers who defied categories. Under their guidance, the neutral zones expanded. The town of Greystone became a true mixed community, where vampire and human children grew up side by side, where interspecies friendships and even relationships became, if not common, at least accepted. Trade flourished. Cultural exchange began. Slowly, painfully, the old hatreds began to erode, worn away by the simple daily reality of coexistence. King Aldrich passed away in his sleep 15 years after the treaty was signed, and his daughter took the throne. She had grown up during the peace and had no personal investment in the old wars. She expanded the treaty, created new neutral zones, pushed for even greater integration. Queen Lysandra remained on her throne, ancient and inscrutable, but she did not interfere with Seraphine's work. Perhaps she saw the value in the peace, or perhaps she simply recognized that Seraphine had become too popular among both vampires and humans to easily replace. Either way, she allowed the experiment to continue. Elias aged, but slowly, gracefully. His hair turned silver, but his eyes remained sharp. His body bore the marks of time, but the blood bond kept him strong, vital, able to stand beside Seraphine not as a fragile mortal but as her true partner. They built a home together in Greystone, a place that was neither human nor vampire but something new, a dwelling with windows to let in sunlight for his sake and deep shadows for hers, with books and weapons, with warmth and cold existing side by side. And they were happy. Not in a simple way, not without complications or struggles, but in the deep, abiding way of two souls who had found each other against all odds and refused to let go. 30 years after the treaty was signed, Elias stood in the main square of Greystone, now a thriving city rather than a small town. Around him, humans and vampires moved together in easy companionship, not without tension, not without the occasional conflict, but with acceptance, with normalcy. Seraphine stood beside him, unchanged by time, still beautiful and terrible and his. Her hand rested on his shoulder, and he covered it with his own, feeling the familiar cold that had become comfort. "We did it," he said quietly, looking out at the city they had helped build. "Not perfectly, but we did it." "We did," Seraphine agreed. "Though it is not finished. This work will never truly be finished." "No," Elias said. "But it is begun. And that is enough." He turned to look at her, this incredible being who had shown him that monsters were not born but made, that fear could become understanding, that love could bridge any divide. "Thank you," he said, "for seeing me that first night, for looking closer when I asked you to, for taking the risk." Seraphine's eyes softened, and she cupped his face in her cold hand. "Thank you," she replied, "for being brave enough to ask me to look, for seeing past the monster to the woman beneath, for loving me despite everything I have done, everything I am." "Not despite," Elias corrected gently. "Because I love you because of all that you are, the strength and the vulnerability, the warrior and the woman who just wanted to be seen." Seraphine pulled him into her arms, her wings spreading wide to shield them from the world, creating a private space in the middle of the crowded square. And there, in the shadow of her wings, she kissed him, this mortal man who had changed her world, who had given her hope, who had shown her that even after 6 centuries of darkness, it was never too late to choose something different. "I love you, Elias," she whispered against his lips, "for however long we have." "And I love you, Seraphine," he replied. "Forever, whether I am here or not. This love will not end when my life does. It will remain woven into the very fabric of what we have built." They held each other as the sun set over Greystone, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. A vampire and a human, no longer enemies, no longer even simply lovers, but partners in the truest sense, architects of a new world. And around them, that new world continued its messy, beautiful work of becoming. 50 years after the first treaty was signed, Elias lay in their bed in the house they had built together. His body was finally failing. Even the blood bond could not hold back mortality forever. But he had lived longer and fuller than any mortal had a right to, had seen his impossible dream become reality, had loved and been loved by someone extraordinary. Seraphine sat beside him, holding his hand, her wings folded around the bed like a protective barrier against the world. She had not left his side in days and she would not leave him now. "I am afraid," Elias admitted quietly, his voice weak but steady. "Not of death but of leaving you. Of the pain it will cause you." "I know," Seraphine said, her voice thick with the grief she had been holding at bay. "But you were right all those years ago. It was worth it. Every moment was worth it." "Promise me something," Elias said, squeezing her hand with what strength he had left. "Anything," she said. "Do not stop. Do not let my death make you retreat back into darkness. Keep building this world we started. Keep proving that connection is stronger than fear. Keep loving Seraphine even if it hurts." Tears would not come, they could not, for her kind, but her voice broke as she spoke. "I promise," she whispered. "I will carry what we built forward. I will honor you by continuing the work. And I will love again someday because you taught me that love is not about possession but about opening yourself to possibility." Elias smiled, his eyes already beginning to fade. "Good," he said. "That is good." He looked at her one last time, this magnificent creature who had become his world. "Thank you," he said, "for looking closer. For seeing me. For loving me." "Thank you," Seraphine replied, "for teaching me that monsters are made, not born. And that they can be unmade by love." Elias's eyes closed, his breath slowed, and then gently, peacefully he slipped away. Seraphine held him long after his warmth had faded, her wings wrapped around them both, and she wept without tears, her body shaking with grief that would have destroyed a lesser being. But she was not a lesser being. She was Seraphine, commander of the Bloodwing Legion, architect of peace, and the woman who had loved a mortal man enough to let him change her. And so, when the grief had run its course, when the first light of dawn crept through the windows, she rose. She prepared him for burial with her own hands, honoring him as the warrior he had been in spirit if not in profession. And then she walked out into the city they had built together, her wings spread wide, her head held high, ready to continue the work. Because that was what he would have wanted. Because that was what their love demanded. Because the story they had begun together did not end with his death. It merely entered its next chapter, one she would write in his honor, with his lessons carried in her heart. And in Greystone and in the other cities that had followed its example, vampire and human continued their messy, beautiful work of coexistence, built on the foundation that a warrior and an emissary had laid when they chose to look closer, to see beyond fear, to believe that love could bridge even the widest divide. The world they had dreamed of was not perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs.